Here is Boston. Cross court.
Lexie Hull looked like she was about to vanish from the WNBA conversation entirely when the 2024 season tipped off. And that fact was almost unfathomable given her background. Because remember, this was the 6th overall pick in the 2022 draft. A player who once lifted trophies at Stanford, carried herself with the poise of a future cornerstone, and seemed destined to make her mark as one of those names you never forget. Yet under former coach Christy Sides, she was collecting splinters instead of minutes, relegated to the end of the bench, while role players leapfrogged her in the rotation, and fans began whispering the question no high draft pick ever wants attached to their name. Was Hull ever going to fulfill her promise? Or was she destined to be another draft bust gathering dust? And that narrative was crushing for a young player with the pedigree she carried. Because it wasn't just about basketball, it was about identity. It was about proving that she belonged at the highest level, and it was about finding her place on a team that looked adrift, but before her professional struggles there had always been a deeper foundation, because basketball was in her genes. Her grandfather played basketball, her dad played basketball, and she had a twin sister who she grew up competing against and alongside. So what was it like growing up in that family dynamic? Well, she has described it as super competitive, one where the game was never just recreation but part of the family's language. And having a dad who played collegiately meant basketball was placed in her hands at an early age. Though her parents also encouraged her and her sister to try every sport imaginable. And that environment shaped the toughness and competitiveness that would eventually become part of her professional identity. And for years, Hull and her sister played everything, developing that versatility, that willingness to adapt. But all of that still didn't prepare her for what was about to come in the pros. Because then came the earthquake. Caitlin Clark, a once-in-a-generation talent, whose arrival didn't just adjust the Fever's lineup. It rewrote the entire identity of the franchise. Because Clark's game was electricity and sneakers. She didn't just score, she pulled gravity, she bent defenses. And the second Clark walked into Indiana, the offense had purpose, the chemistry had fire, and every single player's trajectory suddenly shifted. And for Lexie Hull, this wasn't just another teammate joining the roster. This was a lifeline. This was oxygen after being underwater. This was a chance to reset. And that's why the Fever's 2024 season became such a layered story. One about survival, about adaptation, and ultimately about redemption. And if you want to show support for Lexie, hold down in the comments. Fans were encouraged with chants of Lexie's show, because her journey became symbolic of what happens when persistence meets opportunity. And in her own words, she admitted that it was important to get to know Clark off the court because connections and personal relationships really play a part in the success of teams. And Hull, herself, recently opened up in interviews with outlets like She's for Sports and The Dunker Spot, not mincing words. Peeling back the curtain on what actually changed in that locker room, how Clark's presence flipped her career arc, and what it said about the Fever's transformation from a stumbling mess into one of the most compelling stories in professional basketball. And that shift wasn't just about one player's revival. It was about redemption on multiple levels. It was about leadership that inspires accountability. It was about a culture shift that could define the future of the Indiana Fever. Because while fans and analysts have called Hull the clutch player, it's easy to forget she was drafted in the first round in 2022, with the Fever as the 6th overall pick, carrying the weight of expectation from day one. Yet by the early months of 2024, things had grown brutal for her. Because for all her college accolades and draft pedigree, she couldn't even crack the regular rotation. Watching players like Katie Lou Samuelson and Christy Wallace, players with half her projected ceiling, eating up the minutes she dreamed of, while she sat with a towel draped across her shoulders and a storm of doubt draped across her mind. And in her own reflections, she admitted that at the beginning of the season her playing time looked very different from how it did at the end. So the key for her was trusting that she was staying ready, putting in the work, and preparing so that when those moments finally came, she could take full advantage of them. And she allowed herself to feel proud that she stayed the course and trusted the process despite everything. But that doesn't mean it didn't sting. Because going from a star at Stanford to a benchwarmer in Indiana was a mental hurdle as steep as any physical challenge. And she pointed out that the basketball part of the transition is incredibly tough, because everybody out there on the court was one of the best players on their college teams. Definitely the best player from their high school teams. So now it becomes this mishmash of the very best basketball players colliding. and she was up against opponents who had been in the league for years and years. And while she was battling her own identity crisis, the team itself was spiraling, stumbling out to a 1-8 record to start the season. A start so depressing it had fans in Indianapolis begging for answers, and those answers weren't coming, because internally players were sick of losing, sick of being embarrassed, and at the same time certain that they were better than what the scoreboard suggested. But headlines piled on sharp criticisms, hammering poor rotations, leaky defense, and zero chemistry, and in that kind of atmosphere, everyone in the locker room felt the pressure, and Hull, stuck on the sideline, had to fight her own doubts while the entire ship looked like it was sinking. And yet she insisted on focusing on the small details of her role, saying that part of her job was just to get to the open spots because with such a good offense, eventually, someone would find the open person, and for her, being that open person brought excitement to shoot, to score, to contribute, and to feel part of the team's momentum. So while the outside world saw a player fading into her, Hull doubled down on her grind, sharpening her cutting, ironing out her jumper, and staying perpetually ready for whatever scraps of opportunity came her way. And through all of it, she leaned heavily on the encouragement of teammates who still believed in her potential even when the stat sheets didn't. And that belief became her fuel, and when asked what it was like playing off Caitlin Clark, Kelsey Mitchell, and Aaliyah Boston, Hull admitted they made her job really easy, saying it was awesome to watch them grow, having played 3 years with Kelsey and 2 years with Aaliyah, and she found them incredibly impressive. And then came the real shift when Caitlin Clark arrived and everything truly changed. Because, the moment Clark stepped into that locker room, it was as if the lights came back on. Practices had juice again, fans began flooding arenas, and suddenly Indiana wasn't a punchline anymore. It was the hottest ticket in the league, and Clark brought not just skill, but that relentless edge, that drive to compete. And she demanded that everyone else match her intensity, which is why Hull described how fun it was to play alongside players like Clark, Mitchell, and Boston, pointing out that the defensive attention those stars attracted allowed others, including herself, to cut, to read, and to take advantage of the openings, because those stars were unselfish enough to give the ball up when needed and find the better shot. And she felt lucky to play with them, and as Hull herself said with a laugh, they play against guys in practice, and if they're not winning, Clark is going to do everything in her power to make sure they are competing. And that isn't just energy, that's transformation. And Hull confessed that at first she was caught off guard by the passes Clark delivered, trying to finish plays she hadn't expected to be part of, but soon she realized that every cut she made, every fast break she ran, now carried a real opportunity to get the ball. And once she wrapped her head around that reality, it opened an entirely new dimension to her game, and she recalled moments when Clark, all the way at the other end of the floor, could still make the pass to find her wide open at the block. And that was awesome, because what Clark brought wasn't just star power but a basketball brain wired on fast forward, reading defenses like a veteran quarterback, threading passes into impossible windows. And for Hull, this was a revelation, because suddenly she was wide open in positions she had never found herself before. And as she admitted, Clark was making passes she didn't think were even possible, pulling defenders like a magnet and carving up defenses in ways that freed her teammates, so the Fever's offense was no longer stuck in the mud. It was humming, and Hull emphasized how fun it became to cut with the real possibility of making a meaningful play, which made everything more worthwhile. And beyond the technical skill, Clark's fire was contagious. Her competitiveness spread like wildfire, elevating teammates who once doubted themselves into players who felt they could go toe-to-toe with anyone. Because Clark didn't just bring buckets, she brought belief, and for Hull, that belief was everything. And Clark's maturity and leadership landed instantly with the team, elevating both morale and performance. And Hull herself noted that Clark sees the game at a bigger scale. And with the platform she's created, she has also transitioned that impact to the game itself.
As the Liberty take down the Fever 98-84 the final.
It's really awesome to get to know her as well because, she's a great person. But you have all these expectations put on her, and our team has put on her, and fans have put on her. So to see her kind of be so mature in that transition, it's been really awesome, and I'm just really proud to, have her on the team, and it's been exciting. And what stood out is that the shift didn't happen under bright lights, in front of cameras. It happened behind closed doors in practice. Those sessions, Hull explained, became battles, not drills. Scrimmages turned into wars because Clark demanded it. If a set broke down, Clark pushed them to fix it on the spot. No excuses, no shortcuts. And her competitiveness raised the bar, and the rest of the roster had to rise with it. And coaches saw the change too. Practices that once dragged suddenly had teeth. And from that fight, a true team identity began to form. And when the Indiana Fever had a history-making year, it begged the question, what was that like for you to be a part of that? And Hull answered that she was really grateful. Really grateful for the opportunity to not only play in the WNBA but to be on a team like the Indiana Fever. Because she had seen so much growth, not only on the team side, in how they were performing on the court, but also in the growth in fans. Explaining that on the road, it felt like home games. That they were playing in sold-out arenas they had not seen in the last 2 years before that, so it was just really exciting. And for Hull, this transformation was more than a team story. It was deeply personal. All of it came down to trusting the process. And part of that process was making sure the work was getting done. So she threw herself into sharpening the finer details of her game, dialing in her cuts and chasing consistency with her jumper. And during the Olympic break, they had a full month of practice. She explained, and seeing those shooting percentages climb gave her the belief she needed. That work in the dark paid off in the light. And by the time the second half of the season rolled around, Hull wasn't just another body off the bench. She had carved out a central role in Indiana's offense. And she recalled that one thing the coaches did during that break was post every day after practice their shooting percentages from 2s and 3s during drills, during scrimmages, during everything. And while some people probably thought it was annoying, she personally liked it because it gave her accountability. And none of it happens without Caitlin Clark's presence, because Clark's ability to warp defenses was like giving Hull an open runway. As Hull said, Kelsey and Caitlin attract so much attention that frees players like me to cut and find openings. And those openings started translating into buckets. Hull's percentages spiked. Her confidence surged, and she began making critical plays in high-pressure moments. Suddenly Indiana wasn't stumbling, it was surging, and as Hull admitted, numbers don't lie. Unfortunately, and they're very drastic, and her first 2 years, she was upset because she was putting in so much work and yet her shooting percentages were low, since she would only get 1 or 2 threes a game at most, which made it hard to be efficient with so much pressure on each shot. But numbers don't lie, and posting them allowed her to track improvements, set goals, and keep herself accountable. And as the Fever stacked wins, the chemistry became impossible to ignore. And Hull shared that they never turned on each other. That unity and mindset was what pulled them through the tough stretches. And fans recognized it too, because arenas that once looked half empty were suddenly packed wall-to-wall, and social media lit up with clips, praise, and rallying cries for this new-look Fever squad. And Hull described the adrenaline of home games, saying that playing in front of a sold-out crowd gave them a type of energy they hadn't felt in years. And it was hard to put into words how much it meant. And Indianapolis, once desperate for a winner, was buzzing again. And Hull reflected that all of these people were supporting her the whole time, and she didn't even know it until that moment. Realizing that behind the scenes,